man's pride refusing to make room for the truth. The man's name was Arthur Bowen. He owned the most successful hardware and supply store in a three-county area of rural Tennessee. Built it from nothing. Started with a single storefront, a truck, and 20 years of relationships with contractors and farmers and builders who trusted his word. By the time this story takes place, Arthur Bowen was 54 years old. His business was worth more than anything else in that town. His name was on the sign. His face was known everywhere. He was the kind of man that other men pointed to when they wanted an example of what building something looked like. And in the spring of 1987, Arthur Bowen fired a man named Calvin Reese, the best worker he had ever had, the most valuable employee in the building, the person who, though Arthur would never have admitted it, was holding more of that business together than Arthur himself was. He fired him over pride, over a disagreement that lasted 11 minutes, and within 6 months, everything Arthur Bowen had spent 20 years building was gone. This is that story, and I promise you, it is going to change the way you think about the people around you who are quietly making everything work. Arthur Bowen was born in 1933 in a small farming community outside Nashville, third son of a hardware merchant who ran a modest shop that barely survived the Depression and never fully recovered from it. Arthur grew up behind that counter, learning the names of every bolt and bracket and fitting before he could read properly, learning which farmers needed credit extended through winter, learning which contractors paid on time and which ones needed a reminder. He absorbed the business the way children absorb language, not through study, but through immersion. When his father died in 1959, Arthur took over the shop. It was struggling. Inventory was outdated. The building needed work. Several large accounts had drifted to a newer competitor 2 towns over. Arthur was 26 years old, and he went to work. Not carefully, not strategically. With the kind of relentless physical energy that young men carry when they have something to prove and no backup plan. He renegotiated supplier relationships. He drove to every contractor in a 40-mile radius, personally, to reintroduce himself and ask for their business. He stayed open later than any other hardware store in the county. He extended credit to people his competitors would not touch, and collected almost every dollar of it because he had chosen carefully and remembered everything about everyone. Within 5 years, the shop was profitable. Within 10, it was dominant. By 1975, Arthur Bowen's Hardware and Supply was the largest independently owned hardware business in 3 counties. He had 8 employees, 2 delivery trucks, a warehouse addition he had built himself with the help of 3 contractors who owed him favors, and a reputation that was worth more than the inventory. Arthur Bowen's word meant something. In a world where handshakes still mattered more than contracts in rural Tennessee, Arthur Bowen's handshake was gold. He was proud of what he had built. Genuinely, deeply proud. And that pride, that completely earned, completely legitimate pride, was also the seed of everything that was about to go wrong. Because pride that is earned can still become dangerous when it stops listening. Calvin Reese came to work for Arthur Bowen in 1979. He was 23 years old. Showed up on a Monday morning after hearing through a neighbor that Arthur was looking for someone to help with deliveries and warehouse management. Calvin was not impressive on first appearance. Quiet, slightly built, the kind of young man who does not fill a room when he walks into it. Arthur almost did not hire him. He told his wife that evening, "The boy seems soft, not sure he can handle the physical side of it." But Calvin had shown up at 7 in the morning, without being told what time to come. And when Arthur had tested him, casually, without announcing it as a test, by asking him to describe how he would organize the warehouse to reduce retrieval time, Calvin had given him a better answer than Arthur had expected. Specific, logical, based on watching how the space was actually used rather than how it was theoretically supposed to work. Arthur hired him, and within 3 months, quietly acknowledged to himself that it was one of the better decisions he had made. Calvin worked with an intensity that was not visible from the outside. He did not rush. He did not make noise about his effort. He just produced, consistently, reliably, without needing supervision or praise or reminders. The warehouse reorganization Calvin proposed in his first month reduced retrieval errors by more than half. Within a year, Calvin had taught himself the entire inventory system well enough to catch pricing errors that had been costing the business money for years. Within 2 years, he was handling supplier relationships when Arthur was not available, and the suppliers were calling back faster when Calvin called than when anyone else did. Arthur noticed all of this. He was not a man who missed things, but noticing and acknowledging are different skills, and Arthur acknowledged very little. He gave Calvin small raises when they were deserved. He trusted him with more responsibility, steadily, and without ceremony. He would sometimes tell other people, privately, not to Calvin directly, that Calvin was the best employee he had ever had, but to Calvin himself, very little, because Arthur Bowen had grown up in a world where you showed your appreciation through continued employment and fair pay. Telling a man he was doing well felt unnecessary. It felt like giving something away, and Arthur Bowen had not built what he built by giving things away. By 1985, Calvin Reese was doing something that nobody in that building, including Arthur, fully understood. He was holding the operation together, not officially, not on any organizational chart, but in the practical, daily, irreplaceable way that certain people in certain organizations hold things together without ever receiving credit for it. Let me be specific. Calvin knew every supplier by name, by relationship history, by the specific terms that had been negotiated over years of doing business. He knew which suppliers could be pushed for a better price, and which ones needed to be handled carefully. He knew which contractors were good for their accounts, and which ones needed to be watched. He knew the warehouse inventory not from a system but from memory. He could tell you on a Tuesday afternoon whether a specific item was in stock, without checking anything. He had developed relationships with 3 of Arthur's largest contractor accounts so thoroughly that those contractors would specifically request to deal with Calvin when they called. Not Arthur, Calvin. He had quietly identified and fixed a billing error that had been overcharging one of their biggest accounts for 14 months, and handled the correction so smoothly that the account not only stayed but increased their order volume. He had trained the 2 newest employees to a standard that Arthur acknowledged was higher than what he himself would have achieved. And he did all of this while remaining completely unassuming. No demands, no ego, no politics, just work. The best kind of work. The kind that makes everything around it better without making noise about doing so. Arthur knew Calvin was good. He did not know how good. He did not know, could not see clearly from inside his own pride, that Calvin had become the operational spine of the business, that Arthur was the face, and Calvin was the backbone, and that these 2 things, face and backbone, are not interchangeable. It happened on a Thursday morning in March 1987. Arthur had decided to take on a new supplier, a larger regional distributor who could offer lower per-unit prices on certain high-volume items. It seemed straightforward on the surface. Lower costs, better margins. Arthur announced it at the morning meeting. Calvin listened carefully. Then, calmly, specifically, without any edge in his voice, raised 3 concerns. First, the new supplier's delivery reliability was significantly worse than their current suppliers, based on what he had heard from 2 other businesses that used them. Second, switching would require renegotiating terms with 2 existing suppliers who had given them preferential pricing based on volume and loyalty. Those suppliers would notice the reduced orders immediately. The relationships, built over years, might not survive. Third, and this was the one that landed badly, the price advantage only existed at current volume levels. If business grew, which Calvin believed it would based on 2 pending contractor relationships he was developing, the existing supplier terms would actually become more favorable within 18 months. Calvin presented all 3 points clearly, professionally, with specific numbers to support each one. He was not arguing, he was informing. That was the job Arthur paid him to do. Arthur heard him, and felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with the business analysis. He felt disagreed with. In front of the room, by an employee he paid, an employee whose job was to execute Arthur's decisions, not question them. He did not show it in the meeting. He said he would think about it and moved on. But after the meeting ended and the room emptied, Arthur sat at his desk, and the pride that had built everything began to destroy it. He called Calvin into the office. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Arthur told Calvin that he appreciated his input, but that he had been running this business since before Calvin was old enough to drive, that decisions at this level were Arthur's to make, that he needed employees who supported his direction rather than complicated it. Calvin listened to all of it without interruption, then said, quietly, without anger, "I understand, Arthur. I was just trying to protect the business." "The business," Arthur said, "does not need protecting by you. It needs you to do your job." Calvin nodded, stood up, and said, "Then I think it is probably best if I find somewhere else to do it." Arthur did not stop him. His pride would not let him. And Calvin Reese walked out of Arthur Bowen's Hardware and Supply on a Thursday morning in March 1987, taking with him everything he knew, everything he had built, every relationship he had cultivated, every piece of invisible infrastructure that nobody had bothered to document because everyone assumed Calvin would always be there to carry it. I need to stop here, because I want you to feel the weight of what just happened in that office. 11 minutes, that is all it took. 11 minutes of pride, refusing to make room for truth, and a business that had taken 20 years to build was just handed the beginning of its end. If this story is hitting something in you, if you have ever been Calvin, or if you are honest enough to admit you have sometimes been Arthur, subscribe to Ember and Echo right now. We tell stories like this every single week. Stories about pride and loyalty and the people who hold things together quietly while others take the credit. Subscribe. It is free. And now, let us watch what 6 months without Calvin does to everything Arthur spent 20 years building. The first month after Calvin left was almost normal. Almost. Arthur hired a replacement within 2 weeks, a man named Gary who came with a decent resume and a confident handshake. Gary was fine, competent in the ways that showed immediately, showed up on time, followed instructions, kept the warehouse reasonably organized. What Gary did not have, could not have, was 8 years of accumulated knowledge that lived nowhere except inside Calvin Reese. The first sign of trouble came in the 4th week. A delivery went to the wrong contractor. Not a catastrophic error, the kind of thing that happens. But Calvin would not have let it happen, because Calvin knew without checking which contractor needed what and when. Gary needed to check, and on this occasion, checked the wrong record. The contractor was understanding, but mildly. The second sign came 6 weeks after Calvin left. One of the major suppliers, the one Calvin had maintained the closest relationship with, called about a renewal of their preferential pricing agreement. Arthur took the call, and realized mid-conversation that he did not know the specific terms Calvin had negotiated 2 years earlier, because Calvin had handled it, and the details lived in Calvin's head and a set of notes that Gary could not fully interpret. The renewal came in at worse terms than the previous agreement. Not dramatically worse, but worse. The new supplier Arthur had pushed through, the one Calvin had raised 3 concerns about, began showing problems in month 2. Delivery delays on 3 separate orders, 2 of them affecting contractor timelines in ways that generated complaints. Arthur absorbed the complaints the way he always had, with personal apologies and promises to make it right. But the goodwill he was spending had been accumulated largely through Calvin's careful relationship management, and it was not being replenished. By month 3, the cracks were becoming visible to people outside the business. One of the large contractor accounts, the one that had specifically requested to deal with Calvin, called to ask where Calvin was. Arthur told them Calvin had moved on. There was a pause on the line. Then the contractor said he would think about whether the relationship still worked for his company. He thought about it for 2 weeks, then moved his account to a competitor. It was the single largest account on the books, 18% of monthly revenue. Gone. Arthur sat with that number for a long time, then made a decision that was part pride and part panic. He brought in a consultant to assess the business. The consultant spent 3 days reviewing everything, then sat across from Arthur and delivered a report that Arthur later described as the most uncomfortable 3 hours of his professional life. The consultant identified 17 operational dependencies that had existed primarily in one person's knowledge and relationships. 17 things the business had been doing, efficiently, profitably, effectively, that depended on Calvin Reese, not on systems, not on documented processes, on Calvin. "How did this happen?" Arthur asked. The consultant looked at him carefully. "You had someone exceptional," he said, "and exceptional people make things look easy. So easy that you stop seeing the work, you just see the results. And when the person leaves, you discover the results were not coming from the structure. They were coming from the person." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. "Can it be fixed?" The consultant was honest. "It can be rebuilt, but it will take time and it will cost money, and some of what has already left, the relationships, the institutional knowledge, the trust with certain accounts, some of that may not come back." He paused. It would have been significantly easier to keep the person. By September 1987, 6 months after Calvin walked out, Arthur Bowen's hardware and supply was in serious trouble. The large contractor account had not come back. 2 smaller accounts had quietly drifted to competitors. The new supplier problems had resulted in a formal complaint from a contractor who had missed a project deadline because of delayed materials. The replacement employee Gary had resigned, finding the environment increasingly stressful and the expectations increasingly unclear. A second replacement had been hired, then a third, each one taking weeks to get up to speed, each one unable to replicate what Calvin had carried effortlessly. Arthur had taken out a short-term loan to cover a cash flow gap that would not have existed 6 months earlier. He was working longer hours than he had in a decade, not to grow, not to improve, just to hold the level, and even that was becoming impossible. His wife Eleanor watched all of this from close proximity. She had been watching since March. One evening in September, she sat down across from Arthur at the kitchen table. She did not ask how the business was. She could see how the business was. She asked one question. "Have you spoken to Calvin?" Arthur looked at her. "He left," Arthur said. "You fired him," Eleanor said. "He chose to leave. After you made it clear he was not welcome to stay." Arthur was quiet. "He disagreed with me. In front of my people." Eleanor looked at her husband for a long moment. "Arthur," she said quietly, "that boy spent 8 years protecting your business. He raised concerns because he knew something you did not, and you fired him for it." She paused. "What did your pride cost you?" Arthur had no answer. Not that night. But in the weeks that followed, as the business continued to struggle, as the loan payment came due, as another account announced they were taking their business elsewhere, the answer became very clear. His pride had cost him everything he had built. Arthur called Calvin in November 1987, 8 months after the firing. Calvin answered on the second ring. He had taken a position at a supply company in Nashville, had been there 4 months, was already being given more responsibility than his title suggested he should have, because that is what Calvin did, wherever he went. Arthur did not open with business. He opened with the truth. "I owe you an apology," he said. "What I said to you in March was wrong. You were doing your job, the right way, and I made it about my pride, instead of about what was good for the business." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that, Arthur," he said. "The business is struggling," Arthur said. "I will not pretend otherwise. I would like to ask if you would consider coming back." Another pause. "I have a position here that I think is going to become something," Calvin said. "I am not sure I can walk away from it." "I understand," Arthur said. "I just needed you to know that I know what I lost." Calvin came back. Not immediately, not easily. It took 3 more conversations, a significant renegotiation of his role and compensation, and a genuine restructuring of how the business was organized so that the knowledge Calvin carried was documented and distributed rather than living only in one person's head. It took 18 months to stabilize what 6 months had damaged. Some of it never fully recovered. The large contractor account came back, partially, at a reduced volume that took 2 years to rebuild to its previous level. The supplier relationships were repaired, mostly. The reputation took longer than anything else. Because reputation is the slowest thing to build and the fastest thing to lose. But the business survived, smaller than before, humbler than before, and, in the most important way, wiser than before. Arthur Bowen told this story himself in later years. Not with shame, not with self-pity, with the specific directness of a man who had paid a high price for a lesson and wanted to make sure the payment had produced something useful. He told it to younger business owners, to people who reminded him of himself at 54, successful, proud, certain, and he always said the same things. First, know who is actually holding your operation together. Not who you think is holding it together. Not who has the most impressive title or the longest tenure, but who, if they walked out tomorrow, would reveal the gap between how things appear to work and how they actually work. Find that person, know their name, and treat them accordingly. Second, disagreement is not disloyalty. This is the one that cost Arthur the most. Calvin raised concerns because he knew something Arthur did not. That is not insubordination. That is the entire point of having someone good working for you. A person who only tells you what you want to hear is not an asset. They are a mirror, and a mirror cannot protect your business. Third, pride is the most expensive indulgence available to a person in a position of power. It costs nothing in the moment, and everything over time. Arthur's pride lasted 11 minutes. The cost of those 11 minutes lasted years. Fourth, institutional knowledge walks out the door when people do. Arthur's business was not just losing an employee when Calvin left. It was losing 8 years of accumulated relationships, patterns, solutions, and understanding that existed nowhere except inside Calvin Rees. Document everything, not because you distrust people, but because knowledge that lives only in one person's head is a single point of failure, and single points of failure, eventually, fail. Fifth, the ability to say I was wrong is not weakness. It is the most powerful thing a person in authority can do. Arthur's call to Calvin in November 1987 was the moment the recovery began. Not because Calvin came back immediately, but because acknowledging the truth, out loud, directly, without excuses, was the first honest thing Arthur had done since March. And honesty, like the people who carry it, is irreplaceable. I think about Calvin Rees a lot. The quiet ones. The ones who show up before they are told to. Who fix things before anyone notices they were broken. Who carry more than their title says they should. Who do it not for credit or recognition, but because that is simply who they are. And I think about what happens to the places they leave. How the absence of someone exceptional reveals, immediately, mercilessly, completely, how much they were doing that nobody was seeing. If you have a Calvin in your life, in your business, in your team, in your family, tell them, not someday, today, because people who carry things quietly rarely announce when they are close to putting them down. And Arthur Bowen learned, in 11 minutes, that the moment they do, the weight falls on you, and it is much heavier than you thought.